Hi everyone. So, answering the two questions from each chapter. First one answer from chapter 2, the question explain the four purposes of nonverbal communication by giving a concrete example of each at work. The first of the four purposes of nonverbal communication is to express emotion. One example of this is in the book. It talks about how if you're angry or upset about something and someone asks you what's wrong and you say nothing, like they're still going to know that something's wrong because of the nonverbal communication you're giving them with your facial expressions and your all that stuff. So all the nonverbal communication stuff. The second purpose is to convey interpersonal attitude. An example of this is recognizing when someone is more upbeat or happy in their day, and approaching them at that time. That's what the book example was. An example in my life of this is my mom. When I lived at home, she was always more upbeat and happy in the mornings after she had worked out and everything, rather than when she just woke up. So that's when I'd kind of approach her and try to talk about stuff, rather than later at night or early in the morning. The third purpose is to present one's personality, such as character, disposition, or temperament. But the example I used for this is you probably expect a waitress at a sit-down restaurant or a nice restaurant like an Olive Garden or a Red Robin to probably have more of a personality and be more outgoing than someone who's working a drive-through window at a fast food restaurant, just because that's kind of their part of their job is customer service, and the fast food is kind of just, here's your food in a decent amount of time, and that's what customer service is to them. The fourth purpose of nonverbal communication is to just to accompany verbal communication. Sometimes they're the same and sometimes they contradict each other. The example that the book gave of this, and I couldn't really think of anything besides this one, was like, if someone's lying to you, they're not gonna be able to look you in the eyes. So their verbal communication is telling you one thing, but then their nonverbal communication is telling you that thing isn't true, that they're lying to you. So, the next question I chose is, what are the dimensions of nonverbal communication and how do they help us interpret and make sense of verbal communication? So the three dimensions are immediacy, status, and responsiveness. Immediacy is, I think it's our initial reaction, and we're going to judge them whether it's good or bad or positive or negative, is how the book put it. So then status is, we're going to perceive the behaviors that indicate the status of the person or the communication we're taking place. So like the examples of this were poor and rich, strong and weak, superior, subordinate. So you can kind of tell those by the way you're communicating normally. And then the last dimension is responsiveness, and that's going to be active or passive, and that's kind of just how much we respond, I guess, to the communication, how intense the feelings are to the subject or the person in that communication, nonverbal communication. Moving on to chapter 3, the first question I chose to answer was differentiate between listening and hearing. How are they similar? How are they different? And how are they often confused? So in the book, hearing was, I think the difference that is often confused is hearing is the thing that your body does. Like, it's natural. Everyone does it. Well, most everyone does it. But listening is something completely different because it actually takes like thinking. You can hear unconsciously, like without thinking about it. It's just something that you do. To where listening is actually like consciously listening and like making a point to pay attention and be an active listener and all that stuff that's talked about in the chapter, rather than just kind of sitting there and like, oh yeah, I hear you. But my mom always said, do you hear me or are you listening? And so that's one thing, like, you're not going to get anything out of it if you're just hearing, but if you're listening, you'll take something from that. The last question I chose was discuss at least 2 barriers to listening with a personal example. How do these barriers impact listening in your example? So the first barrier I chose was failing to limit distractions. I think a big distraction for me at least is smartphones and the internet and all that stuff. Like even as I was doing my homework tonight, there was a lot of times where I'd be like, oh, I'm gonna go look at this for a second, and I find myself scrolling through my phone for like 20 minutes at a time, and I'm like, I can't be doing that because it's distracting me from what I'm trying to do. Or I'll be watching a lecture and someone starts talking to me, and that's a distraction, right? So yeah. And then the second barrier that I chose was failing to focus on the message. And one thing the book brought up about this was multitasking. And I think a lot of times I try to multitask, and I'm a big sports guy, big baseball guy, so I'll try to multitask and I'll be like doing my homework with a baseball game on the TV, and it doesn't work very well because half the time you get sucked into that baseball game and then you have to start back from ground zero because you forgot everything you've learned while you were doing your homework, if that makes sense. So that kind of stuff. Those are both barriers, and those are both personal examples to me. And so, yeah,